What is up, everybody? Welcome back to another edition of the Sheehan Show here on Sherdog.com. My name is Sean Sheehan, and I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Canada's favourite son, Aaron Bronsteter, to talk some MMA. A few different topics. Going to throw at Aaron here, and we're going to have a little chat about it over the next 30 minutes. Aaron, thank you very much for joining me. I really appreciate it. We've chatted once or twice before, but I don't know if we've sat down for this long to have a good bit of a chat about MMA, so I'm looking forward to it. How are you this morning? I appreciate getting up a little bit early to talk to me this morning over here in Ireland.
Well, no worries. I had my coffee, so I can say that I'm happy to be on the Sheehan Show on Sherdog.com with Sean Sheehan. And I can probably say it 5 times fast because, you know, we've got the adrenaline flowing. There's a lot of MMA news for us to cover, so why don't we get to it?
I've struggled to say that so many times, to be honest, and it's worse when you're with severe MMA as well, because there is the tendency to sometimes say severe MMA instead of Sherdog and Sherdog instead of severe MMA. So yeah, that's a constant struggle we always deal with around here in the Sheehan Show. Let's get into it and let's talk. I was going to talk about a few different topics, but then over the last couple of days we had these mega announcements from Dana White. And the Canadian card, I suppose, was foremost in those. And I definitely want to talk to you about that Canadian card. But let's start there because Belal Muhammad versus Jack Della Maddalena has been announced as the main event. Manon Fiorot will challenge Valentina Shevchenko for the flyweight title. And there's some other good fights on the undercard as well. Alexa Grasso's fighting Natalia Silva, Gilbert Burns and Michael Morales obviously going down on May 10th over in Montreal. I know there's been a tendency from Canadian fans to be a little bit disappointed with some of the cards over the last while. I feel like this is a little bit different though. It was happiness from what I saw from the Canadian reaction to this. How do you feel about this card? Is this the sort of card you think the big Canadian market should be getting?
I've heard kind of a mixed bag from people, but I keep saying to them, like, you got to look at what's available right now. Like, I know that you probably want to have Jon Jones versus Tom Aspinall on the card in Montreal, but that's not realistic. You have to go division by division, and we just saw the women's strawweight championship take place. We've got the women's flyweight championship on this card, and I think that was kind of a no-brainer from the start with Manon Fiorot being the next challenger, her being French-speaking, the card being in Montreal. I think they want to get a good amount of French-speaking fighters on this card in order to have the local media have people to ask questions to and whatnot. And then the bantamweight division, you got Pena probably against Harrison next. So that was probably an option that they had to look at. But I don't think that they wanted to put women's bantamweight and women's flyweight championship fights on the same card. So you kind of put that to pasture. Then you look at the men's flyweight championship, hadn't been announced yet. That I'm sure was a possibility. Bantamweight, we just kind of saw with Merab and Umar. Even though Merab says he wants to stay active, I didn't think that was really a realistic option. Featherweight, that's going to be in May, so that's off the table now. Oh, sorry, in April rather, and we'll talk about that soon. So you go division by division, and there's just, you have to see what's left, and that's kind of what Canada's getting, is what's left, and what's left is the welterweight division. And I think that they had to kind of make a move there because with Shavkat injured, they had to. Again, you look at what had to happen with Leon Edwards and Jack Della Maddalena and the cards shuffling, because I guess kind of the next logical guy, especially with Ian Gary coming off a loss. I think you probably could have made a case for Ian Gary with how close that fight was with Shavkat. I don't think anybody would have made a fuss. In fact, that probably would have been a bigger marquee main event over Jack Della Maddalena because, you know, no disrespect to Jack, but he doesn't have a lot to say. And I think that when you look at press conferences and who can really get people going for an event, I think Ian Machado Gary probably would have been a better fit there, but he's coming off a loss, and we got to look at Jack being undefeated in the UFC. So I guess that's probably how they looked at it when they were making this fight. But again, you look at what's kind of left over, and that's what I think the Canadian fans get in these situations. But I think if you compare it to like a UFC 312 in Australia, I think this card compares very favorably to that. And we don't even know what most of the card is. Like, there's still probably 8 more fights, 9 more fights that are going to be announced.
I think it's interesting because I feel like the hardcore MMA fans are always trying to get the champions to fight the next person. Like, I think we're kind of sick of people moving divisions, and we want the next GSP, we want the next Demetrius, we want the next Jon Jones who takes on challenger after challenger after challenger. But then when we get it, it's like, oh, why is Manon Fiorot fighting for why is Jack Della Maddalena type of thing? And Yeah, that's a bit of
But they're
collateral
both
damage, I
undefeated,
suppose.
right? Like
Yeah.
Montefiore hasn't lost in the UFC. Jack Della Maddalena hasn't lost in the UFC. When I say undefeated, I mean in the UFC.
Liam
But
McCourt will have something to say about that.
yeah,
Yeah,
but yeah, exactly, fair enough. But yeah, when you look at their UFC records, they've been spotless and they've been beating good competition. So like I think that they've earned the title fight. I think that the Jack Della Maddalena thing kind of caught people off guard. But at the same time, I think it's still a good fight. Like I think if you're going to put a welterweight championship together and Shavkat's not available, like what's the next best thing? This is probably it.
It's interesting the point about Ian Gary as well, because obviously I might be a tad biased in that one, but it doesn't it felt like him versus Shavkat was the number one contender fight. It was a really close fight that could have gone either way. I think a couple of adjustments. I think most people acknowledge that, and it was one of those fights where there was no loser coming out of it. And even a lot of people who were, who didn't like Ian Gary before it became fans of him, I think, afterwards. And I think your point is well made, like that if they had given him the title shot with, if they'd given the title shot in front of Shavkat, it would have been bad. But with Shavkat injured, I think it would have made an awful lot of sense. But the other side of that, I think, is Belal. I want to talk about Belal for a second, because Belal is one of these guys that, he gets a lot of traction online. He has improved an awful lot as a fighter. His style, his style is, I think it's like an exciting style if you like that style, and if you choose not to, it's like the most boring style in the world. But like, at least there's something. But like Belal, people try to say Belal's an uninteresting guy, but I don't think that's necessarily the case. What do you think about the run of Belal and where he is at the moment and how people view him? Like, I think he's an interesting test case for the UFC, because like some people get in this position where I feel like the fan sentiment is just so against him, and maybe it's fair in some ways, but maybe it's unfair in the other ways. What do you think of Belal?
Well, it's really kind of a product of circumstance with Belal, in my opinion. So let's rewind a little bit. We'll start with the Sean Brady fight. Sean Brady fight, exciting. I think it was about a first round finish, if I'm not mistaken. Might have been second round finish, but either way, great finish over a guy that was at that point hadn't lost yet in the UFC. Very, very good win, and I think people were kind of, that was an exciting fight. It's hard to say otherwise. Then the next fight is kind of the problem, because he gets a fight with Gilbert Burns on very, very short notice for both of them. I think it was like 3 weeks notice for both of them. So I don't think we saw, and I think it was right after Ramadan, if I'm not mistaken. It was like around the time of Ramadan. So you're getting kind of a diminished product in Belal Muhammad, and he does what he needs to do to win that fight. Like, he won that fight, and it was a pretty dominant performance over a guy in Gilbert Burns who had fought really, had fought for the title somewhat recently, had a great first round against Kamaru Usman, certainly a guy that's at the top of the division. But because it was such a short notice fight, you kind of got to see an unpolished version of Belal Muhammad. And I think that kind of detracted from him in that sense. And then the Leon Edwards fight, it was in the middle of the night. People were exhausted. The rest of that card didn't deliver at all, if I recall correctly. I think there was one exciting fight on the main card, if I'm not mistaken. You probably remember best because it was on your time zone. Well, actually, sorry, it wasn't on your time zone. It was in the middle of the night.
Well, that is kind of my time zone.
Yeah. So like it was like 5 a.m. or something when that fight happened. So everybody was exhausted. Dana White was exhausted. So when he took the podium after the card, he was kind of like, well, that fight didn't really deliver and all that. But at the same time, if you go back and watch that fight now, and it's not in the middle of the night, it was a pretty good fight. Like, I thought that Belal did what he needed to do to win. I thought it was a relatively close fight because there were rounds that, based on the criteria, you could probably have scored for Leon, because there was so much grappling involved on the Belal side. And then when you look at the actual like damage and effective striking, like, you can make a case that Leon did somewhat well in that fight. But like, it's very easy to say, like, Belal broke Leon Edwards in that fight. Like, Leon Edwards did not show up that night, and I thought that Belal really put a pace on him. And I think that if you go back and watch that fight now, it's a more exciting fight than you would remember, because, like I said, you have to think of the product at that time, which was middle of the night. Fans were kind of tired. The card, wasn't living up to expectations. So all those things need to be considered. So I think Belal's kind of gotten a bit of a raw deal. Not to mention, Belal also took over a year off, if I'm not mistaken, between the Burns fight and that fight, because he didn't want to give up his position in the division. So, like, I think that Belal's kind of a product of circumstance in this situation.
Yeah, that's fair. And also, like, if himself and Leon Edwards fought before, and I know it was a no contest in the end, but like, Leon Edwards kind of giving him a shellacking in that fight, if you go back and watch that, and for him to turn that around and dominate him the way he did, you have to give him a bit of credit. But I don't think it's one of those fights that the Canadian fans are going to be quiet during. Let's put it that way. So that's fun. I want to ask you another question, and maybe we'll jump back and forth here, but I'm asking about Canada and the scene in Canada, because it felt like when these fights were announced, I saw a lot of sentiment was like, there's no strong Canadian fighter to main event, or there's no strong Canadian fighter to be, one of the standouts on the main card. And that got me kind of thinking about GSP and how big of a fighter he was, and how big of a fighter he was for Canada and a sportsman in Canada. And, obviously we've had a similar thing here with McGregor. Now it's turned a bit, let's put it mildly like that. But he did create a raft of new fighters. We just spoke about Ian Gary. Look at Paul Hughes fighting for titles. And we're obviously a very small country with a lot of other sports and a very, very small MMA community, but still it happened. It feels like in Canada, which is obviously one of the biggest countries in the world, with GSP coming through at the time when MMA was kind of coming through in North America, it didn't really produce, like we had Rory McDonald. Obviously we've had some good Canadian fighters. I don't mean to denigrate the Canadian fighters in any way, but there hasn't been a whole load. There hasn't been a real star coming since. Can you pinpoint why that is, or am I being a bit harsh? Is the Canadian scene better than I think? But it feels like, to me from the outside, that it's a bit weaker than maybe it should be because of what came before it with GSP.
Yeah, I think that's a very valid point. And I think one of the reasons for that is, GSP is a consensus top 3 guy. Like, he's like in the very top tier of fighters all time in combat sports. Canada's not a very big country. Like, we don't have a lot of big gyms. We don't have a lot of big kind of major metropolitan centers. Very similar to Ireland, I would say, is probably, a good comparison. Ireland, like you said, has a lot of talent coming up. Canada sort of does too, to an extent. Like, we've got a lot of different fighters that are, in the UFC or on the cusp of the UFC, but we don't have a GSP. And a big problem that a lot of these fighters have is that once they hit a certain level, the GSP comparisons, like Mike Malott, 170 pounder, Rory McDonald, 170 pounder, like those guys get to a certain echelon, and then everybody's like, well, are they the next GSP? Like, the expectations need to be tempered, I think, quite a bit from the Canadian fans if you're expecting another GSP, because quite frankly, like, GSP was a real lightning in a bottle moment. He was an incredible fighter during a time where, the sport was really in its infancy, and it really helped grow this sport in Canada. But I do think that the shadow of GSP looms very large on a lot of these Canadian fighters. And it's going to be a while before we see another fighter that gets into that becomes a champion, quite frankly. Like, and I think Ian Gary could get bit with the, like, Rory McDonald bug. If he doesn't get to become a champion one day, he'll be a guy that, was always kind of on the cusp. And that's what Rory McDonald was. And Rory McDonald was an amazing fighter and got to the championship level. But I think right now in Canada, we also had, during COVID, our regional scene completely dried up. And a lot of the fighters that would have otherwise gotten into the UFC and had an opportunity, by the time COVID ended, now they're like 32, 33, and they're kind of past what their prime years would have been. Like, have to give a lot of credit to fighters like Jasmine Jasdavicius, who went and fought stateside during COVID to stay busy so that she could get to the UFC, because she was really a late starter. I think she started training at 27, 28 years old, similar to a Belal Muhammad. So she's kind of in her prime now, despite being 35, 36 years old. So I think that's kind of where we're at right now with Canadian MMA and the state of Canadian MMA.
I think it's very interesting. I think, we've looked at, many countries down through, like Brazil, obviously with Anderson Silva, and obviously many other fighters that came before him as well. And it feels like, and Ireland and, the UK with Bisping and all, and it feels like there's always been a steady stream of pretty good fighters coming through from all of those countries, even Ireland, but I never thought we'd produce a fighter like Ian Gary or Paul Hughes again. Like, that'd be very hard. But if the fact that Canada hasn't really, Rory McDonald was a very, very good fighter, absolutely. I feel like maybe it's coming. I feel like maybe someone will emerge over the next while. Let's take a turn. We talked about fights that were happening. Let's talk about a fight that is happening, maybe not happening. Jon Jones versus Tom Aspinall. I don't think there's ever been, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, and maybe it's a bit of recency bias, but there's ever been a fight that the fans have demanded more. Like, I think everyone, like, back in the day, wanted to see the Chael and Anderson rematch, and a litany of other fights. But I feel like this one, like, Jon Jones was signed up to fight Stipe. Stipe got injured, and they made the fight again. And people just like, no, this fight should not be happening. Tom Aspinall has to fight Jon Jones. The second the Jon Jones fight was finished, We need this fight now. Announce it now. And it's been going on steadily, I feel like, for about 18 months. Do you think the fight will happen? Is it going to happen? Is Jon Jones going to take this fight? We know Tom Aspinall wants it. Well, Dana White said last night that they're going to make it and they want to. Do you see it happening? Is it going to happen this summer?
This summer, I think that there's a better chance of Ilya versus Islam happening at International Fight Week, if I had to guess. I think if they're going to do Tom versus Jon, we're probably waiting until New York, probably waiting until November. But the clock's ticking. And I saw yesterday there was a rumor that Ciryl Gane would be fighting Aspinall in Montreal. And I hadn't heard that anywhere aside from that rumor mill online. And I thought to myself, like, if they're going to make that fight, they can't have it for the interim championship. Like, Tom Aspinall's next fight has to be for the undisputed heavyweight championship. Like, you just can't keep having two heavyweight divisions simultaneously with two different belts. Like, you can't do it, right? And not to mention, do you want to risk, like, I think that if Aspinall fights Ciryl Gane, he's probably a 4 or 5-1 favorite. No disrespect to Ciryl, but what happens if Ciryl Gane beats Tom Aspinall? Like, now there's no Jon Jones fight. Like, the allure is completely shattered. So I think the UFC have kind of a saving grace here with Ilya relinquishing the title and saying, I'm moving to 55 full time. Like, this isn't me dipping my toe in the pool. Like, I'm jumping into the deep end. And I think that, and I'll probably get murdered for saying this, but Ilya Topuria versus Islam Makhachev is a better fight than Jon Jones versus
100%.
Tom Aspinall.
Yeah.
It's a better fight.
Mm-hmm.
It's a higher level fight at this stage in the game. That being said, the appetite for it is nowhere near as high as Aspinall versus Jones, because you're talking heavyweights. Heavyweights are always, like, the UFC haven't had a big heavyweight fight in a long time. What would you say is the last big heavyweight fight that you've had? Like, maybe, like, I guess the Cormier and Stipe trilogy was a cool trilogy, but I don't know how much hunger there was.
It's in COVID as well, now, wasn't it?
During COVID. Like, one of them was in an empty arena, like it was in the Apex. I think it was the third of the trilogy was in the Apex. So that kind of took some of the air out of the balloon. But I think that, Ilya versus Islam is, like, those are probably the two best pound for pound fighters right now. Like, we can't sleep on that fight, but no. I think that the appetite for Jones and Aspinall is even higher.
I don't know what it is about Tom Aspinall, to be honest, because, like, I followed Tom Aspinall since the Cage Warriors days. There's tweets of me saying, like, he's going to be a world champion back in 2015 or something, but, like, and I still don't understand it, and I'll tell you why, because MMA is a sport of knowns, right? It's always, whoever the champion now is never going to lose. And it's always been that way, always. And Jon Jones is the one guy that's always been right for, apart from Matt Hamill. Yet, everyone is 100% sure that Tom Aspinall is going to beat Jon Jones. And that to me is so fascinating. And it's the reason why I want to see the fight maybe more than the actual fight itself. Because, as you say, the Islam and Makhachev fight's an even more alluring fight, and we might get a chance to talk about Topuria here in a second. But what is it about Aspinall? Is it the heavyweight thing? Is he just one of those guys that the fans have gravitated to for some unknown reason, as has always been the case, or is there something else? Can you pinpoint it?
Well, like you said, I think it's knowns versus unknowns, and what we know is that Aspinall smoked Pavlovich. He smoked Curtis Blades in the rematch. He's beating, like, legit heavyweight challenge, like, contenders right now. And not to say that Ciryl Gane isn't that. And, like, I think that a lot of people, like, we need to give Jon Jones his flowers for that 100%. Ciryl Gane fight. And we got to see a lot more of Jon Jones against Stipe, but I think Stipe looked like a totally diminished product in that fight. And that's why I think a lot of people are saying, like, who's Jon Jones really beating? He took down Ciryl Gane. We've seen that Ciryl Gane's takedown defense is still kind of suspect. We saw that in the Volkov fight. Like, I think that, we're finally going to see Jon Jones face somebody who's kind of on equal footing as him. And I think the Dominic Reyes fight kind of was that at the time. And a lot of people think that Reyes won that fight. Like, that was kind of Jon Jones facing the younger upstart, which you haven't really seen. And Jon had always been the young upstart, going back in his career. So, like, I think that if you look at Thiago Santos, I think Jon Jones is still younger than Thiago Santos and was in his maybe a little bit older than Anthony Smith, but not much. Like, Jon Jones hasn't really fought somebody who's, like, younger and, like, in their prime in a long time. Really, since Dominic Reyes might be the only time he actually has fought somebody younger and in their prime. So I think that that's kind of part of the allure as well. And I think that a lot of people feel that Jon Jones is just a lot more beatable at heavyweight because he's not really the most potent finisher at heavyweight. Like, it took him a while to get Stipe out of there. And like I said, I think that Stipe was kind of a diminished product at that point.
Very interesting. I'm looking forward to seeing how that all rolls out. Right, we've 10 minutes left, and I have to bring up judging because like I feel like we could do a 2-hour podcast about judging, and I'm going to throw a question at you that I hate being asked myself, and I've been asked it many times on podcasts. What do you think of judging in MMA in 2025? How because obviously the two of us have put as much work into talking about judging and trying to learn about it as probably anyone in the media sphere. I think that's fair to say. What do you think? Like, everyone knows my thoughts, I suppose, on it, and I have pretty strong thoughts. But as someone who's studied it, who's looked at the cards in the way you should over the last few years, what do you think the state of MMA judging is right now?
Yeah, I think the state of MMA judging is fine. I just think that the judges are still, kind of beholden to an archaic scoring system that doesn't fit MMA, and that's always going to be what the problem is. Like, I don't think it's the judges themselves. I haven't seen a decision where somebody has won a fight where I'm like, that's just a complete, like, it's unjustifiable. Like, we get maybe one of those a year in the UFC. Like, we're talking like one fight a year. Like, I think last year there was one. Well, there was one scorecard, like the Paulo Costa split decision with Sean Strickland. Like, I can point to that one specifically as like a really egregious scorecard. Even the like Renat Fakhretdinov against Carlos Leal, like I think you could still make a case that Renat won two of those rounds
100%.
if you're sitting cage side and you're looking at that fight a little bit differently. But like we're not seeing a lot of like real true robberies. Like that Angela Hill fight, a lot of people were like, oh well, she should have lost that one. But at the same time, it's like there's a lot to score in those fights. I thought that the second and third round were relatively close. Like it's nothing that I'm going to lose sleep over. So I think that the state of judging is not like as bad as everybody makes it out to be. And I think that betting on the sport has really exacerbated it as well, especially when you see like favorites lose to underdogs, like people's parlays get smashed and they're all like, oh, that's terrible. Like you have to not look at things through foggy glasses. You have to be, and you also have to understand the vantage point that the judges have are very different from what the home viewer has. Like I think that, I've said this many times. I think that education is like paramount in fixing the kind of gap between the audience and the viewer. Like if I was the UFC, if I wanted to help people understand things, like I would do a show on Fight Pass where every Monday or Tuesday you take one of these judges that have judged tons of these fights, like a Sal D'Amato, and say, hey, Sal, we got a nice retirement package for you. Stop judging. Be our guy for Fight Pass. We're going to put GoPros in the spots where all the judges are sitting. And that way, when there's a scorecard that perhaps the public didn't agree with, you can maybe show them what did the judge see during this round that might have led them to believe that this fighter won. And have like a whole show where called You Be the Judge or something like that on Fight Pass every Monday or Tuesday where people can go back and watch the round from the judge's perspective and see what the judges are seeing. Because I think that's a big divide. And a lot of people are saying, oh, the judges should sit in soundproof rooms and just watch the broadcast with no commentary. It's like, I don't know if I think that'll align the judges a little bit more with the viewing public, but I'm not sure if that is better for the fighters or fair for the fighters.
Yeah.
So like there's just a lot of different things that they could do. And I think the 10-point must system, a boxing system that's catered to 6, 9, 12 rounds doesn't really work for a 3-round fight. Like I think if you had a half-point system and you gave the judges a little bit more latitude with what how they score fights, you'd see better scorecards as well.
That's the point where I would disagree now, because like I actually think the system works like relatively well. The biggest issue with the system is it's hard to decipher close rounds, and it's hard to pick a definite winner of close rounds. But the problem with that is there's no system that will do that. Like there's absolutely no system. And if there is a system, I think it will be more imperfect than the one we have. I was actually talking about this at the weekend, and I think the biggest issue with people looking at the system and go, oh, that doesn't work for MMA, is that it's pie in the sky. Like, what is going to work for MMA? There's like the half-point system, I think is, I don't know, I just think it's nonsense. I don't think it's much different to what we have now. It's just a different way of saying it.
I disagree. Because I think you're giving the judges more latitude, and I think that a lot of the people that watch the sport, they see a really lopsided 10-9 round, and then they see 2 close rounds. They're like, oh, well, look, this guy's all cut up and everything. But like the GSP Hendricks fight, I think is a great example. If you go back and watch that, like if you go back and watch it round by round, like I think you can make a case that GSP won that fight, and everybody thinks it's this big robbery. But like if you could have half point rounds and then some of those Hendricks rounds are 10 to 8.5 and some of those GSP rounds are 10 to 9.5, I think you're giving painting a better picture of what the fight actually is to the people at home. But I also know the decimals are confusing for people.
Yes.
And, if you're adding more confusion to the mix, you're just going to give people more things to criticize about judging.
Yeah, you can also solve that problem by just having more 10-8s and 10-7s, and you don't need to have fight system, which is the same thing, I suppose. And I think we were going that way for a good while, and I think it was working better. But I think the thing about the system is like, I think we need, maybe it's a judge or maybe whoever it might be, on like a big platform to explain not the system, not why we score rounds 10-9 or 10-8 or anything like that, the actual idea around why we score and where the sport is going. Because we like the rule set is and should be written how we want the sport to go. So like, what do we want out of the sport? We want excitement, because like there's more decisions all the time in the sport right now. We want more finishes. The criteria, it is and it should be written towards, if you try to get a finish, you will win a round. And I think if there was there is an acknowledgement of that in the rules and by the judges and by the officials, but I think if we, like, if the general public maybe got that a little bit more, and maybe if the rules were rewritten and the criteria was rewritten to have that foremost in everyone's minds, because like that, the idea, I think, around the system is more important than the system itself, which is a kind of a buzzword, I suppose, for modern sports. But like, is there any way, like the half point system is just an adjustment of what we have now? Is there any other system you think? Have you seen any of the one championship judging, or judging the round as a whole, or judging the fight as a whole, or whatever it might be that you think might work a bit different? Is there any ideas you've seen floated around that you think might be good for changing the judging if that was to happen?
I mean, I don't mind pride judging and just say, this guy won. But that being said, you can't really show your work, right? And I think that's what one of the problems that the judges have is, like, have to keep an inventory of 3 full rounds in your brain and try to figure out which way the pendulum is swinging. And at the end of the day, like, if they say, well, why did you give it to that guy? If you don't have, like, if you can't say, like, well, this round this happened, like, there's just a lot to unpack if you're trying to use pride scoring. So I think giving the judges a little bit more latitude, and that's why I'm a proponent of the half point system, is like something where a judge can say, like, hey, I gave this a 10 to 8.5 because I thought that at this stage in this round we were close to seeing a finish. Like, I think if you look at like Cannonier versus RoboCop this past week, like that first round to me is like a 10 to 8.5 round for RoboCop. Like, I think that's the way you would score. Like, that's what a 10 to 8.5 round would look like. He got dropped twice, but he got up quickly, recovered, and then like went back to grappling, was countering, like he was with it. I think that like is like the perfect example of a 10 to 8.5 round, because if you look at that 10-9 round versus the next 2 10-9 rounds that followed it, like that round is a more dominant round for Rodriguez than the next 2 rounds were for Cannonier.
My argument to that is always, if Man United beat Liverpool 1-0, they get 3 points. If Man United beat Liverpool 10-0, they get 3 points. That's just sport. That is just sport. And like, we're all like, there's
okay,
never.
But Sean,
yeah,
nobody's gonna say they didn't beat them 1-0 or 10-0. Like the evidence is right in front of them. There's nothing subjective about it. It's an objective. A guy kicked a ball, unless they missed a penalty or something, but like, guy kicked the ball into a net. That's a point. In MMA, there's none of that. Like, it's just a guy who's watching it. Like, I've had a judge explain it to me. It's like the difference between, it's like grading a math essay versus a math exam versus an English exam. A math exam, it's like there's answers and you can show your work and get that answer. And in an English exam, you're looking at it, you're taking the data and you're saying like, oh, like how prescient is this data? And like how, I now have to grade the words on this sheet and analyze them. Like, I think the judging in MMA is a lot more like an English exam than a math exam, because it's not like 1 + 1 = 2. That's
more the process than the outcome, though. Like, no matter what the process is, we're going to have an outcome at the end, and like it's going to be 10-9 or 10-8 or whatever it is. And I'm like, the outcome can be the same under different circumstances, and that, that, as I said, that's the case in all different sports. And it's like, I said this at the weekend as well, and I'll reiterate it again, and we'll move on from it then. It's like, if we are looking for perfection in MMA judging, we're never going to get it, because there's going to be rounds all the time that are going to be either GSP or Hendricks. Who won it? No, and no one can give you an answer to that. At the end of the day, there's a judge going to have to go, GSP won it. There's another judge going to have to go, Hendricks won it. And Sean is going to say GSP, and Aaron's going to say Hendricks, and then they're all going to disagree. And that's always going to happen unless you fight to a finish, which is, again, a bit pie in the sky. So, I think the criteria we have at the moment, it's relatively easy to understand if you look into it. It's only a couple of pages. It works pretty well. You can understand it pretty well. There's very little robberies under the system we have. I don't think there's too much wrong with it. But anyway,
and I would kind of agree. I just think that one of the disconnects is that people are always watching it through the lens of the broadcast. And like that I think is just something you can't really correct unless you kind of take my idea that I mentioned earlier, where you have GoPros there and you can or the judges wear like those Meta Ray-Ban glasses and can record what they're seeing. Unless you have that and you have a judge every week that kind of breaks it down for people to understand and close that gap. And I think that what Andy Foster does in California, where you can attend the post-fight meetings, is really pivotal as well. And I'm actually going to reach out to Jeff Mullins of the Nevada State Athletic Commission and say, hey, are you open to me attending a debrief after UFC 311? I attended the last one. Here's an article I wrote about it. 313 is next one, UFC 313. Here's an article I wrote about UFC 311 and the debrief that they have. I'm not here to I'm not here with pitchforks. I think that it's good for the public to understand why judges might have scored around differently than perhaps they did.
Yeah, 100%. And I wish that the judges were allowed to do more interviews, because, we've both spoken to judges, and I think maybe we're a little bit to blame why they can't do interviews anymore, because even though they didn't say anything bad in any of our interviews or anything like that, I just don't think the powers that be like them speak. And I can't understand it for a way, because you're only making a rod for your own back by saying some things, because people can shoot it down. But I think I don't think there should be judges coming out doing interviews every week. I all you're going to get is the betting people you spoke about earlier on just going and saying, and that's illogical. But anyway, Aaron, I really appreciate the time. I want to throw a couple of quick fire questions at you. For 2025. Okay. Alex Pereira, does he fight at heavyweight in 2025?
Yes.
Amanda Nunes.
Who's next? Because if he beats Magomed Ankalaev, who's next? Right? There's not really anybody.
100%. Amanda Nunes, does she fight in 2025?
I'm going to say, we're kind of up against the clock right now, right? Because the soonest that we're going to see that 135-pound championship is probably June, right? Nothing's really announced for that card in June. So I'm going to say no.
Oh, interesting. I think she does.
I'm going to say
no. Who does Pantoja fight next?
Kai Kara France.
Interesting. Who does Merab Dvalishvili fight next?
Sean O'Malley.
Oh, interesting. Is Ilia Topuria a champion in the UFC in 2025? Again.
Ooh, that is a hard question. See, the problem is the only sample we have of him at lightweight is that Jai Herbert fight, which is probably the closest fight he's had in the UFC. So I'm gonna say no. I'm gonna say no until he feels an Islam and knows what that's like. I think there's a chance that maybe he fights Charles Oliveira this year and then doesn't fight for the title until next year. So I'm gonna just go with the percentages and say no.
I've 2 questions left. Okay. If you had to pick maybe an outsider contender to be a champion this year, who would it be? Who would you be picking?
Outsider contender to be a champion this year. I'm going to say Yan Xiaonan.
Oh, interesting. She's fighting. I saw
she's fighting Virna.
Yeah. Interesting.
Virna in Miami. If Weili wants to move up to flyweight, that title gets vacated, and maybe she has a path.
And that was actually my last question for you. We're nearly there. Who are the 3 female champions going to be at the end of the year?
All right, I'm going to lean into my Yan Xiaonan and say Yan Xiaonan.
You have to know.
I think that Weili is going to vacate if she wants to move to flyweight. I'm going to say Manon Fior at flyweight.
Ooh, interesting.
And I'm going to say Kayla Harrison at bantamweight.
Do you know what? I maybe I don't agree with the Yan Xiaonan one, but I like the other 2. I agree with them. Aaron, thank you.
That said, I do think that a Kayla Harrison and Pena fight is closer than the odds indicate. I think that Harrison, when it opened, was a 4-1 favorite. I think that Pena can make that fight interesting.
Yeah, is Harrison a tad overrated? Is that I don't like.
It's not that she's overrated. I just think that she's not her best product at 135 pounds. I think that the weight cut for her is a lot, and I think I think if you look at what she looked like at 155 pounds versus 135 pounds, she was, I think, just a better fighter at 155 pounds without having to completely diminish herself. The week of the fight.
Yeah, 100%. Aaron, I really appreciate the time. Thank you very much for joining me. Go over to Twitter, everyone. Check out Aaron's work. If you're on here, you probably know Aaron already anyway. So there's no point saying that. Thank you very much for your time, Aaron. I'll definitely have you on again, and I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
It's always a pleasure to be on the Sheehan Show on Sherdog.com with John Sheehan. So thank you for the invite.
Beautiful.